Hey everyone, welcome along to another video. This week on How to Read, we're going to be looking at queer theory. Queer theory looks at the way that social categories and identifications are formulated, bringing together those who are marginalised through the process of normativity. That is, the creation of norms that regulate society as a whole. The use of the term queer is through the reclamation of a slur used against LGBTQIA+ people, first triggered by the initial AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. The outbreak of the HIV virus was largely ignored by various political administrations, but particularly by the Reagan administration in the United States. Political activists rose up against this, and a field of academic and philosophical argument stemmed from this, what we now know to be queer theory. The most prominent discussions that take place within queer theory is that everything in society is interpretable as construction and is therefore based around the prevalent norms of that society and are therefore subject to challenging. Originally, queer theory was interested just in areas around sexuality, looking to areas of non-conformity, i.e. anyone who wasn't heterosexual, and the ways in which such groups face different forms of oppression. Interestingly, it was a common perception, and in some ways still is, that sex is a private act that has no bearing on the public or political life, but that just isn't the case. Look at the debates around gay rights and abortion, for example. Another key point is the discussion of gender and the idea of performativity, which means the ways in which gender is inscribed into daily life. The simplest example we can see of the coding of gender is through the idea that boys wear blue and girls wear pink. This, queer theory argues, creates scripts around gender, which people are expected to abide by. What this also means is there's a potential to subvert or react against these supposed codes and scripts. One of the most famous examples of subversion of gender roles can be seen, somewhat controversially, through drag. Drag kings and queens emphasize explicit gender roles through their appearance and through the use of exaggeration, which often ridicule those roles. The crossing of supposed static gender categories also shows us two things: how rigid they actually are and the fact they're actually a construction. One's gender shouldn't stipulate how they appear or behave. The most important monolith that queer theory seeks to undo is something called heteronormativity. This is the name given to the wider set of norms that are inscribed or written into society. The most obvious way we see this is through the privilege enjoyed by cisgendered, straight, white, able-bodied, middle-class men. The fact that anything outside of that formulation can be labelled as queer often leads to a specific criticism of the field itself. In talking about so much and being so fluid, it really doesn't talk about much at all, and subsequently dilutes the impact of certain groups and their experiences. However, the fact that large swaths of the population are regulated to being second class or queered suggests there's a need for a field of study that looks to solidify the experiences of those who are marginalised and oppressed in society. What this also means is that queer theory is constantly self-reflexive and critical, interrogating the ways that discussion take place across lines of gender, sexuality, race, class, culture, disability, and so on. It also means that it's important that those working in queer theory, as in any area, are critical to their own standpoint, being attuned to the ways that they benefit from different forms of privilege and how that might impact on their own practice. Trans individuals are most likely to suffer harm, and this danger is increased exponentially across lines of race and class. It becomes important that spaces are created for the experiences of those groups and that they are actually heard. One of the most important things that queer theory thinks about is the challenge of complicating societal issues whilst not overly simplifying the lives of those being oppressed. This also means that as a field of study, queer theory is by no means perfect. We might see the ways in which race and class can be overlooked, particularly when considering the stories that are told. Often they lean towards a white and middle class lens. This is true of the field, and some theorists such as Jose Esteban Munoz have sought to challenge the way that the canon or body of work around queer theory retains a white middle class focus. This has been furthered by theorists who have sought to seek out the transnational consequences of difference through linguistics and geography, to name just a few. In doing so, these theorists also work to specify the importance of thinking about identity as multifaceted, or basically not being comprised of one single thing. We might think about the approaches to decolonizing the curriculum, which takes a similar approach in thinking critically about the books that are read as part of an Anglo-American education system. This also provides links to ideas of colonialism and post-colonialism, thinking about how culture has been dominated by particularly Western whiteness. These are the kinds of ideas that have really started to be explored given the rise of recent technology, and how people from vastly different backgrounds and communities can come together and learn from each other. It is much easier to access these kinds of resources resources than previously, and without the expense of being able to travel great distances. What this also suggests is the way that queer theory contains a dynamic approach to understanding the ways of living and being. The increased focus on overlooked communities is something we see reflected back in culture, with the increased range of representation that is beginning to become apparent in popular media. There is still a long way to go though, and queer theory helps us dissect those cultural representations, understanding what they can tell us about the world and whether they are sufficient. Think about discussions about trans representations as well as queer people of colour. These are all areas that queer theory can help us think more about. Many people think of queer theory as a bit of a head, but stick with it. The reason it's so challenging but also rewarding is that it teaches you to completely rethink the way you understand the world by drawing your attention to the implicit codes or scripts that unknowingly define our life, whoever we are. That's why it's also important to recognise, even if you don't necessarily identify as queer, there may be ways that you are queer without you even realising. And if you're not, it's important to recognise the way that you benefit from privilege and what you can do to help lift up those who may be indirectly or oftentimes directly oppressed by that privilege. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, and ring the bell to receive notifications. See you next time.